Hi everyone, my name is Martha Thompson and I'm the host of Rocky Mountain Views. Today we are delighted to have as our guest a woman who is a noted author, blogger, and today we're here to talk about her brand new book called Sober Mercies, How Love Caught Up with a Christian Drunk. Welcome everyone to Heather Kopp.
And now I'm a noted Christian drunk. Well, thanks for having me, Martha. Thanks.
Oh, I'm elated to have you here. I have read your book and actually reread your book. And do you know there are so many books that have been written about recovery. They're written about the struggle. But they don't necessarily speak to what life is like afterward.
Yeah.
And that makes this truly unique. Most of all, it addresses a person of faith who is having to deal with a problem that somehow all of their belief and all of their teachings hasn't been able to help them overcome.
Yeah.
So maybe the difficulty as someone with an addiction, as a true believing Christian.
Yeah.
So if you wouldn't mind
Sure.
taking a look at that and reading that, it made things very clear for me.
Oh, great. Love hearing that. Okay. And I believe this is from the epilogue, I think.
It is.
Yeah. Okay. At a recent meeting, I met a woman who wore a chunky cross necklace and clasped and unclasped her hands nervously in her lap. Clearly a newbie, her voice trembled as she gave a little speech I've heard before. I'm a Christian, actually, she said. I don't know how I ended up with this problem. I know God, but for some reason that hasn't kept me from getting addicted to food and alcohol. I can't believe I'm here. My heart went out to her, and I wondered for the umpteenth time if we Christians don't make the most miserable addicts. Since we tend to think of addiction strictly as a moral failing, most of us try and fail for years to pull ourselves up by our spiritual bootstraps. We pray harder, repent more fervently, and fight temptation until we're blue in the face. When our best efforts continue to fail us, we feel ever more guilty and ashamed and confused. Don't we love God enough to quit? Doesn't God love us enough to deliver us? Meanwhile, to even admit that we've become addicted feels like a betrayal of Christ's work on the cross. Too often, in order to shield those we love and to protect God's reputation and ours, we try to hide our problem. Ironically, it's our desire to maintain a good witness that turns us into sneaks, liars, and hypocrites, which then turns us into prisoners of our own egos. In my case, I think my faith wasn't enough to save me because addiction isn't a sin issue alone. These days, instead of viewing addiction as either sin or sickness, I believe it involves both. We're all sinners, of course. We all battle compulsions and obsessions. We make choices that are fair to call sin. That is, we make choices that offend God and hurt others and us. But when these behaviors progress to the point of addiction, things get more complicated. Now we're dealing with a condition that includes very real physical, psychological, and spiritual components.
Thank you for that. Do you think that the confusion over alcoholism, addiction, being seen in the medical community as a disease is something that Christians in particular struggle with as opposed to it being a moral or sinful issue? Do you think that's one of the reasons that so many don't reach out for help?
I think that's a huge part of it. I came from, in my 20s, I was part of a very evangelical, wonderful church, but very conservative. And I remember being taught that people who say addiction is any kind of sickness or disease are making an excuse. And they just don't want to call it sin. And I bought into that, and that's all I had ever understood either. And so the whole time that I was struggling secretly with my alcoholism, really it didn't occur to me to go outside of the church to seek help because I continued to see it as a moral issue, not a sickness. So I thought the church should be adequate to deal with that. I repent, right? And I remember being in treatment, and a counselor started talking about it being a disease. And I, raised my hand and objected and said, well, I've heard that's just an excuse, and since it's something that you could choose not to do, then how can that be a disease? And he, very kindly and patiently explained to me that it's very similar to, you could say the same thing about a diabetic or someone who gets lung cancer because they smoke cigarettes, or gets diabetes because of their eating habits. It doesn't mean those things aren't diseases that are going to progress the lung cancer and can kill them and hurt them.
Wow.
And so that was very eye-opening to me. And so I think where we get confused is on the front end, if I know that I'm drinking too much and I choose to, of course at that point, it's just it's a bad choice. But once we become addicted, physically, psychologically, and emotionally, it takes on the components of a disease because it is progressive and it gets worse and worse. And another thing I think a lot of people don't understand about alcoholism is that our physiology is different. How we process alcohol is different. And I remember having it explained to me in a way that really helped me. A normal person walks into a room, and let's say make it a wedding. They walk into a wedding, they're thirsty for alcohol. They have a glass, they have 2 glasses. Their thirst for alcohol gets satisfied. And after a couple glasses, they're done, they've had enough. But the alcoholic walks into that same wedding, is thirsty for alcohol, has a glass or 2 of wine, and instead of feeling satiated or less thirsty or in any way satisfied, that alcohol, which the enzymes aren't metabolizing the way it works in our body, and I can't give you all the medical details of it, but what it happens to us is we get more thirsty. And it triggers what's called the phenomenon of craving. And when I was first getting sober and trying to understand this, I remember there was an evening where I wanted to drink desperately. And the realization, I finally understood what they were saying. And I realized if I do take a drink or 2, because I wanted to think I could take a drink or 2, I realized I'm going to want a drink way more than I want one now. And the next one, and the next one. And so beginning to understand some of these things, which I learned in treatment and in recovery, helped me so much to see the bigger picture, and that isn't only a moral issue. So
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Complete sense.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you the way that I became aware of your writing was through your blog. And the blog is called Sober Boots. And before I start talking about Sober Boots and the book, would you explain to the audience how you came up with that name?
It's kind of a funny story. The truth of the matter is during all the years when I kept a secret stash at all times, I have a separate closet from Dave. And so for me, it was I like to drink those little mini bottles like you get, at the airport or on an airplane, They serve those on planes, but they also serve those in liquor stores. You can find them everywhere. So, but I loved those because I could carry them in my purse and, they were portable. I could stick one in my sock, and if I was wearing boot pants, walk around the living room with one in there. So I loved those. And, but I would store those. I would stuff those in my tall boots in my closet. That was where I hid a lot of my alcohol. And because I love boots. And so, the idea is that my boots were thirsty and they finally quit drinking, and now there's nothing in them except my feet. And so Sober Boots kind of seemed like a great idea for the blog. The second part of the story is that every year that I stay sober, Dave buys me a new pair of Frye boots.
Outstanding.
So I now have 5 pairs of Frye boots. Actually, I have more than that. And those I call people that know that he buys those for me. Even if they don't know the closet story, they say, "Oh, you're wearing your sober boots." So actually, it was my daughter-in-love. I call her my daughter-in-love, who suggested that as the title for my blog. And I thought that's a great idea. That's fun. Let's go with that. It's easy to remember.
What a wonderful way to take a time of tragedy and turning it into something beautiful.
Yeah. I love it.
Well, I can tell you that the attraction for me in reading Sober Boots, and particularly in reading Sober Mercies, if anyone is looking for some type of pretty picture of what active alcoholism looks like or recovery looks like, this is not the blog or book for you, because it is amazingly honest. The humility that you have, the honesty that you have in writing this is astounding. There's, with most people that I know that are in recovery, there's often a source of guilt or shame, or wanting to say that's my former life. That's not who I am today. Let me tell you who I am today. This is a blueprint for saying, no matter where someone is, I've been there, I know what that feels like, and it's going to be okay. And if you follow a few little steps, your life can be beautiful too. And I just can't thank you enough for writing these books. Truly.
Thank you. Well, that really was the goal in writing the book. When I was still drinking, especially toward the end when I was getting more and more desperate, I would go into bookstores and I would buy and read recovery memoirs. But they were always just this very dark descent, and the whole book was about that. And then at the very end of the book, the person decides to get help, and then it ends, and you don't quite see, well, then what? And so I always assumed must be nothing to write home about. It didn't make me want to get into recovery. And I still had that stigma in my head, and I still pictured, very this low bottom rabble drunks, who were living under bridges, and I just knew I wasn't one of them, right? Of course I am one of them, which is part of the journey I share in the story. And I think as far as being honest and not having that shame, for me, that was such a huge part of my recovery, because I was in so much shame and so much secrecy for those 12 years where I was drinking every single night and hiding from the world, and in so much fear and shame. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone knowing. My greatest fear was people finding out. I was frantic to hide my problem. And the irony, of course, is that the shame comes from the secrecy. And I was just shocked when I finally did break into the light, when I finally got to that point of misery and surrender, and I knew what I had to do. All I had to do was tell Dave the truth, because I knew the minute he knew just how bad it was that, he would insist I get help. So, but once I broke through that, the freedom I felt, the relief, instead of the waves and waves of shame I imagined and I thought I was avoiding, I realized, no, that's what you felt when you were in the dark. Once you come into the light, it was just like such a relief. And then I just thought, I want other people to know this, that you don't have to suffer in that shame, and that if we're willing to, lay down our ego, let our pride get smashed, there's such wonderful joy and freedom in that. Because if you give up your pride, you don't have to protect it anymore. There's nothing to protect. And so
very true.
You can't hurt my pride if I don't have any. And so being at the bottom somehow was just one of the most wonderful times of my life. And going forward, I think because I was so secretive, to the extent that I had to hide my problem in recovery and to stay sober and be healthy, it's the same extent I feel like I need to be really public about it. I'm not public about which programs I use, but I'm very public and open about the fact that I am an alcoholic and I am in recovery, and I want to do my little part to make that stigma less and make other people, and talk about how wonderful recovery is. I was so shocked. I thought, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen to a person. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. The best thing. And I'm way happier now than I think I could have been had I never become alcoholic, had I never had to go through that breaking, had I never had to get the help. And now I have this community of friends and people I love and love me. And the redemption God has done in my life in the last 5 or 6 years is just astonishing to me. And in April it will be 6 years since I walked into treatment. Yeah.
Well, that is astounding, and people do need to hear that message.
Yeah.
I want to step back just a little bit, though, before you arrived at that day, because you do write so honestly about blackouts, arguments with your husband, including but not limited to even locking him out of the house one night, and
naked.
having to leave poor thing, and leaving yourself notes so that you have an idea of what might have taken place that night.
Yeah.
So in looking at all of those times where there would have been an opportunity to say, hey, I need help, what was different? What happened? Because I know that there are people that are hurting.
Yeah.
I know that they're either struggling themselves or they have family members that are struggling, and they don't know what is it going to take to have an opportunity to get well. And I'm sure you're well aware of the fact that most people who are suffering from addiction don't receive help.
No.
So many die of these diseases.
Absolutely.
So if you can let us know, give us a snapshot, a picture of what
changed.
Happened.
Yeah. It's a combination of things in retrospect that brought me to that point. One of the biggest things that did happen was the increasing consequences of my drinking were getting so severe that it was scary. And we were living in Oregon for most of my alcoholism. We moved to Colorado Springs in 2006. And at that time, I was hoping, maybe the fresh air will change things, or maybe it will get better, or maybe no. And it actually got worse than ever. And I was so alone. I didn't know anyone in this town. And now I had to go to the liquor store because they don't have wine in the grocery store, And every now and then I drank hard liquor, but I was mostly a wine drinker. Because back in Oregon, for me, in the little town, for me to go get hard liquor, I would have had to go in this big store right in the middle of our little town, and everyone would have seen me. So I didn't do that. But anyway, what it took, I began to have such severe blackouts. A blackout, I didn't know what that was when I first got into recovery, but a blackout means that in the evening you're drinking, you're drunk, but you're talking, walking the dog with your husband, you're watching TV, you seem conscious.
Okay.
But the next morning you wake up and you have absolutely no memory beyond 7 o'clock. And that would happen to me. It was starting to happen to me almost every morning. And I would wake up and I could not remember a thing, like I didn't exist. Last I knew, we were getting ready to have dinner. And so what I began to do to cope with that, because it began to embarrass me, when people would come to pick me up to go do something, or I'd wake up in the morning and go, did I call my old friend from high school? What did I say? They call that drunk dialing. It was horrifyingly embarrassing. And I knew, so I began to do this little thing where I would you're right, keep a secret journal. And write in it while drunk at night, try to scrawl little notes about what was happening. 8 o'clock, walk dog, talk L and O, watched Law and Order, whatever it was.
Okay.
And then the next day I would try to find my notebook. Hopefully I hadn't decided to hide it somewhere new when I was drunk, which I often did. And if I could find it and if I could make it out, it would help me pretend to Dave that I remembered what we did the night before. Yeah. So I couldn't work anymore. I couldn't, as a writer and editor, your brain, my brain was getting pickled and I was just feeling like I couldn't actually do the work anymore. And that scared me. And it's like the gig, it's like I could look into the future and see the gig is gonna be up. But I was determined to drag it out as long as possible because of my pride and my humiliation. And I didn't want to give it up. I mean, I couldn't imagine the misery of waking up at 7 in the morning and then knowing I'm going to feel the same way at 7 at night. And I had a morning, I don't know why it happened that morning, because I had tried to surrender so many times, but it always ended up with me bargaining somehow and not making it all the way over the line. But God showed up one morning and I found myself on my knees sobbing hysterically. And I knew something was happening and I was begging God to save me, but I was begging in a way that made all the previous, prayers seem insincere. I mean, it was like I'm drowning in the ocean kind of praying. And I got up from that time with God and I knew something had changed, and I hoped that he had miraculously delivered me. I hoped that he had I was never going to drink again. That afternoon I started drinking and I was devastated. And then I realized that what had happened is I had surrendered and I was willing now to get help, to reach for help. And so that was the evening Dave came home and I told him the whole truth. And then I got help and I went to treatment. And I think as Christians in particular, we want the miracle that will happen in private and allow us to keep our image and not be embarrassed and not have to get help.
I see.
And so we pray for that. We want that. And I think all along, I'm so glad now that God didn't do that for me, that he didn't. Because some people do. They get relieved of their addiction at the foot of the cross and they no longer drink. But I'm so glad that didn't happen for me, because I needed recovery and I needed to learn this new daily dependence on God. And I love having a daily miracle. Every day I get to rely on God for a miracle. And that's so much better than one that would have happened and I would have walked away and said, oh, that was bad. I'm better now.
And it sounds like this daily dependence upon God is different than it was before. Although you were a heartfelt Christian before.
Completely. A lot of the difference was I had a relationship with God, but I had been taught during my formative years of my Christian faith that it was all about having your beliefs right. So I had a lot up here in my head. I knew the Bible. I could have written you a Bible study about trusting God, but I had no actual experience in my soul of being truly desperate for God and truly relying on him for something. And so when I got sober, I remember being shocked in recovery to look around and realize these people actually trust God. A lot of them who have no Christian background, no religious background, or even are sort of anti-religious, but they trust God and rely on him in a way that I don't even know how to do. And it has nothing to do with a belief system in their head. Right. It has to do with a relationship. And they came in and said, I am desperate for God. I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to turn over my life to God and rely on him. And based on that experience of God proving faithful, then they start coming to conclusions about God. And I had come to faith the opposite way. I had all this, and I had none of the experience of it.
That's beautiful. And now, another part of the book that I really enjoyed reading is that it was a night that you were playing a game with your family and newly sober.
Yeah.
And so, of course, by now, things should be great, right?
Yeah.
And you found yourself having to take a look at maybe the alcohol was just a part of the problem and the work to be done might be within you. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, it was so disappointing. It was so disappointing. I really thought, I had so much arrogance. I came into recovery with a lot of arrogance. And the first 6 months, I didn't, get a sponsor. I didn't work steps. But because I thought, pretty much it was the alcohol. And now that I was sober, well, surely the alcohol would account for all my bad personality, all my bad behavior, and my competitiveness, and my tendency to say mean things and think they're funny. All these aspects of myself, and rage and anger, all these things that I attributed to alcohol. And so I couldn't wait to show off to my kids, my grown kids, this new, and I just imagined myself suddenly deeply spiritual and serene, and it was just, and yes, it was eye-opening the first time we all got together, because I quickly forgot about this new serene person I was, and the Heather was still there. It was the same Heather minus alcohol. And so not only had my personality not changed by getting sober, but it was way more clear to me how much it needed help. And then at some point there, I realized, maybe I have more work to do than I thought. And maybe I need to do what's suggested. And maybe I don't have so much going for me, that I'm different than these other addicts and alcoholics around me. And it was very humbling. And I did finally, at 6 months, I had a relapse in the Minneapolis airport, and that woke me up. That woke me up to the fact that, okay, I need to really do this thing. Yeah. So it is a spiritual process. It's a spiritual journey, and you don't get to stop, and you don't arrive, and you don't graduate, which is another thing that sometimes Christians will say to me, well, that just seems, wrong, or why do you have to keep doing this? They don't understand that I get to keep doing this, and that this is part of my spiritual life, and my recovery is an important part of my spiritual life, and I'll continue to do that, I hope, as long as I live. Along with the rest of my spiritual life. It's an important piece of it.
I think that's important, and for those who read your book and read your blog, which again I cannot recommend highly enough, it is not simply for those suffering from addiction. It's for those who choose to grow. And hopefully none of us want to ever stop that process. Hopefully all of us want to be a better version of ourselves tomorrow than we were today. And I think that your book absolutely points us in that direction. And I just cannot thank you enough for being with us today, Heather.
Oh, well, thank you, Martha. It was wonderful to be here.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to seeing you again on our next edition of Rocky Mountain Views. Until then, thanks so much. I'm Martha Thompson.